Dear friends, think about it. In the depths of history, in the dark waters of the vast ocean, lies a legend, Titanic. Not just a ship, but a symbol of human ambition, hope, and tragedy. How did this giant, defying the world with its size and awe-inspiring with its luxury, disappear into the darkness of eternity overnight? This is the story of an epic buried in the depths of the seas, but never forgotten. In this video, I will take you back in time, to the dream workshops where the Titanic was born, to the laughter that echoed through its luxurious corridors, and to the freezing cold waters of that fateful night. Together we will discover how this ship began as a dream and turned into a disaster. But fear not. Here you will find traces not only of sadness, but also of courage and the strength of the human spirit. Now close your eyes and immerse yourself in those years. Imagine the huge ship leaving Southampton Harbor, handkerchiefs waving excitedly, ship's whistles piercing the sky, all embracing a dream. But what secrets lay beneath that dream? Let's step into Titanic's epic journey together. First stop, the birthplace of this great ship, the beginning of a dream. Ah, friends, isn't it fascinating to witness an era that shaped dreams? Titanic was a child of such an era. She was born at a time when industrialization was rapidly changing the world, and technology was pushing human dreams. But this was no ordinary ship. Imagine the Queen of the Seas with its gigantic dimensions, a work of art representing the pinnacle of society with its luxury. However, this magnificent journey would be as short as a dream. It all started in the early 1900s. An ambitious company called White Star Line was in fierce competition with its rival Cunard Line. Cunard had taken the lead in speed with two giant ships like Lusitania and Mauretania. White Star Line had a different plan. It wanted to offer its passengers a unique experience by prioritizing size and luxury over speed. Titanic and her sister ships Olympic and Britannic were the product of this vision. Their goal was not just to cross the Atlantic, but to leave an unforgettable mark in maritime history. Titanic's design was entrusted to one of the most brilliant engineering minds of the era, Thomas Andrews. Built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, this ship was planned from start to finish as an engineering marvel. At nearly 269 meters in length, it was the largest man-made vessel of its time. Steel plates secured with rivets formed a strong hull. Each of them was divided into 16 watertight compartments, and it was here that the legend of the unsinkable ship was founded. It was thought that even if the ship was damaged, these compartments would keep the water in a confined space, and the Titanic would not sink. But Titanic was not just a solid structure. It was also the embodiment of luxury and comfort. Think of the first-class salons, elegant dining rooms, majestic staircases, gilded decor. Every detail was a symbol of wealth and prestige. Comfortable cabins for the middle class, and even the third class offered exceptional amenities by the standards of the time. This ship was not just a means of transportation. It was like a floating city that carried people from all walks of life to the Atlantic with dreams. Titanic took nearly 2 years to build. Starting on March 31, 1909, this process took shape at the Harland and Wolff shipyard with the labor of thousands of workers. During construction, as news spread about the size and splendor of the ship, People admired her, and the legend of the unsinkable ship spread from ear to ear. For White Star Line, Titanic was not just a ship, but a symbol of power and competitive superiority. But hidden in the creation of this legendary ship was the blindness that such overconfidence breeds. Ah, dear friends, when the construction of the Titanic was completed, the world was talking about this ship. Her maiden voyage from the port of Southampton was not just a transportation event, it was a spectacle. But no one knew anything about the tragedy that was hiding under this dream. Imagine now the idea that such a magnificent structure could sink into the darkness of the sea overnight was unthinkable. But fate can upset one's plans, no matter how grandiose. So how did the Titanic, carrying such a great dream, begin its journey? What did the passengers who boarded that ship dream of? The answers to these questions will lead us to one of the greatest tragedies of history. Let's step into the beginning of that unfortunate journey together. Ah, my friends, Titanic was not just a ship. It was a manifestation of human dreams and desires, a colossal work that pushed the boundaries of technology and epitomized wealth and luxury. But Titanic's grandeur lay not only in her size, but in her details. What made her the queen of the seas was the craftsmanship and innovation that went into each and every piece. But 4, 6, 0, 0, 0. Titanic was the largest and most powerful ship of that era. Her steel plate hull was designed to defy the raging waves of the Atlantic. It was 269 meters long, a distance of almost 3 football fields. With powerful steam engines, 4 massive smokestacks, and 3 propellers, she was designed to move gracefully but steadily over the water. She could reach speeds of 23 knots per hour, an impressive speed for a gigantic ship of the time. Titanic was a timeless structure, not only in terms of engineering, but also in terms of comfort. But the real beauty of this ship was in the world that was hidden inside. Titanic was divided into 3 main sections, each with a different story and class. The first class welcomed the most elite members of society, wealthy industrialists, famous artists, politicians. For them, Titanic was not only a means of transportation, but also a status symbol. Marble floors, gilded chandeliers, libraries and dance halls. The famous grand staircase at the heart of the ship made you feel as if you were stepping onto the stage of a ball. And the dining rooms, as the aroma of the delicious dishes prepared by the chefs danced in the light of the large crystal candlesticks. Every detail offered guests a piece of paradise. But it wasn't just the rich on board, was it? Second-class passengers enjoyed a more modest luxury. Their cabins were simple but comfortable, with their own dining rooms, libraries, and social areas. Traveling on Titanic was a dream for many middle-class passengers. They too enjoyed crossing the Atlantic, enjoying the ship's amenities. Supposedly, the ship's first crew were able to cross the Atlantic for about 2 weeks, each adult sleeping on a passenger's barrow. But in those days, in third class, dear friends, this is where Titanic's heart really beat. This was the home of immigrants, of travelers overflowing with hope. In small and simple cabins, many of them dreamed of a new life with their families. For them, the Titanic was not just a ship, but a gateway to the American dream. The third-class dining room, as modest as it was, served some of the best food many had ever seen. Most passengers were in awe of Titanic, marveling at the size and splendor of the ship. Titanic reflected these class distinctions in every detail, but the ship's segregation would be unexpectedly erased by the cruel hands of fate. Until then, no one would have believed that Titanic could sink. But imagine the coming together of these three classes, these three different worlds, all on the same ship, all for the same dream. What common destiny awaited them? And what of the dangers that lay in the shadow of luxury and splendor? Was the Titanic really unsinkable? Let's discover together how this legend was shaped before the voyage began. My friends, I take you now to that unforgettable page in the history books, the morning of April 10th, 1912. The harbor of Southampton was the scene of activity far beyond an ordinary day. The sky was reflecting the slight coolness of spring, and the huge Titanic was waiting at the docks in all her splendor. People were examining this gigantic ship with admiration and some amazement, and those who dared to approach it were mesmerized by its mind-boggling size. This was not just a voyage, this was a dream come true. There was a bustle in every corner of the harbor. Cargo workers were carrying passengers' luggage to the ship, while filling Titanic's enormous belly with the last ingredients: fresh fruit, thousands of bottles of wine, the finest champagne, and of course, hundreds of different foods for each class of the ship. Even the details behind these preparations revealed just how big a dream Titanic was. It was not only food and goods that she carried, but hopes, dreams, and human stories. As the hours passed, the ship's surroundings turned into a fairground. Southampton's locals flocked to the harbor to witness this piece of history. First-class passengers stepped elegantly aboard, dressed in their finery and swagger, while third-class passengers lined the quayside in a much more subdued but perhaps more meaningful excitement. For them, Titanic symbolized a beginning that would radically change their lives. Stepping on board that ship, with their suitcases on their backs, holding their children's hands tightly, was the first step of a dream. And finally, that enchanting moment arrived. The ship left the port of Southampton at 12, accompanied by the applause and farewells of the crowd. As the huge propellers crashed into the water, Titanic sailed gracefully but resolutely towards the high seas. For those on board, this was the beginning of perhaps the most memorable journey of their lives. But of course, everyone had different expectations of this voyage. Arriving in Cherbourg, Titanic again drew attention with its splendor. From there, the ship was joined by several other famous passengers, including some of the richest people of the time, such as John Jacob Astor. Then the ship headed for Queenstown, where most of the third-class passengers joined the ship. Stepping aboard at the last moment, these people dreamed of starting a new life with hopeful eyes. For some, it was a journey of leaving poverty and hardship behind. The atmosphere inside the Titanic, on the other hand, held a different story in each class. In the first-class lounges, elegantly dressed people clinked glasses, chatted to the naive melodies of the orchestra, and praised the comfort of the ship. In second class, there was a look of satisfaction on the faces of the passengers. In third class, the joy of children and the enthusiasm of immigrant families filled the ship. Each one of them had boarded this huge ship in the hope of fulfilling their dreams. In the early days of Titanic, everything was fine. The unique atmosphere on board made everyone feel somehow safe and special. But my friends, the events that would follow in the course of this story would take the simmering life on board the Titanic to a whole new level. And what would become of the fate of the passengers on this ship? How did this dazzling beginning turn into the most tragic maritime disaster in history? Let's dive into the next pages of this story together. My friends, I will now tell you how the glorious voyage of the Titanic took a dark turn. In this story, everything was caught between the ruthless nature of the seas and the overconfidence of men. Imagine this gigantic ship sailing the vast waters of the North Atlantic, shining like a star under the heavens. But behind the mesmerizing scenery, danger lurked, an invisible enemy, approaching in icy silence. Traveling the Atlantic in those days was always a daring endeavor. Sometimes the sea was a friend, sometimes an enemy. With the arrival of spring, the giant ice floes in the polar regions would slowly begin to melt, and these gigantic icebergs would drift southward with the currents towards the ship's routes. That spring of 1912, the North Atlantic was experiencing an unusual intensity. It was rumored that the glaciers were moving faster than usual, and that huge icebergs were threatening the trade routes. But my friends, the captains and passengers of such a magnificent ship as the Titanic, had not yet fully grasped the seriousness of this danger. P. Cofer Ducat, Friends of the Pioneers. The ship's radio system was one of the most advanced technologies of the time. Titanic could receive messages from other ships and communicate quickly with her surroundings when necessary. In the early days of the voyage, several iceberg warnings were received by telegraph. These warnings gave information about the huge ice floes observed by ships in the vicinity. But Titanic's radio operators were often too busy sending passengers private messages to give these warnings the attention they deserved. Imagine that some of these messages did not even reach Titanic's bridge. At the time, the ship's captain, Edward Smith, and his crew were so confident in Titanic's majesty and resilience that they did not consider changing the course of the voyage or slowing down. Yes, a few radio messages were brought to the captain's attention, but these warnings were that an iceberg was at an uncertain point in the vast ocean. How could an unseen threat be so underestimated? That evening, the waters of the Atlantic were extraordinarily calm. The surface of the sea was so still that it almost looked like a mirror, but this was actually a danger sign. When the sea was calm like this, it would have been much more difficult for observers to spot icebergs because there were no waves. Those huge ice floes were almost invisible in the dark. Nevertheless, on the Titanic's observation mast, two sharp-eyed lookouts were constantly monitoring the surroundings. That night, however, an important detail was forgotten. Somehow the binoculars on board could not be used because the keys had been lost. Despite all these warnings and signs, the Titanic continued on its majestic northern course without slowing down. Perhaps being the captain of such a great ship gave a man incredible self-confidence. But my friends, the sea is never a place to be taken lightly. Nature makes no exception for any man or any ship. And how long would the Titanic sail through these dark waters, unaware of this threat? How would the silently advancing iceberg in all this negligence trigger one of the greatest tragedies in history? Let's take a journey to those moments together. My dear friends, I will now take you back to that black night. It was a night when the silent whisper of the seas witnessed the beginning of one of history's greatest tragedies. The year was 1912. The date was April 14th. As the clocks approached midnight, the Titanic was sailing with great confidence and splendor in the dark and cold waters of the Atlantic. But this voyage would be the scene of a test between the arrogance of man and the relentless power of nature. As the clock struck 11:40 p.m., the ship's lookouts could see danger approaching from the top of the mast. In the darkness, beneath the starless sky, a silent giant had appeared, an iceberg. But this suddenly realized giant was very close to Titanic. The lookouts signaled the danger by ringing bells and alerting the bridge. Officers on the bridge immediately tried to save the ship by braking the rudder and reversing the engines. However, Titanic's enormous size and speed prevented them from executing this maneuver in time. And then the moment came. For a moment, everything stopped. Then there was an eerie sound of friction on the ship's hull. It sounded like the gut-wrenching screech of metal breaking and shattering. The ship had hit the iceberg. But my friends, the impact was not an impact at all. The Titanic had touched the edge of the iceberg, and a series of gashes had opened in its side, as if a thin cut had been made with a huge knife. At first glance, these wounds did not seem serious. Many passengers did not even feel the impact of the collision. But the cuts had reached Titanic's most vulnerable point, its watertight compartments. It was here that the great confidence in the ship's design began to break down. Yes, Titanic had watertight compartments at the bottom, but they were only horizontally separated. Once the water breached the top of the bulkheads, it would flood into the other compartments in a chain reaction. And unfortunately, this collision triggered just such a catastrophe. Immediately after the collision, the crew moved quickly to assess the condition of the ship. Some passengers on the lower deck had noticed for a moment that water had suddenly flooded into their rooms. First, the ship's 4 forward compartments began to take on water. But this was only the beginning. The designers had calculated that Titanic could float if up to 4 compartments took on water. However, the collision with the iceberg affected all 6 compartments, sealing the ship's fate. Chief Engineer Thomas Andrews examined the ship after the collision and soon realized the terrible truth. Titanic was going to sink. This was not just a guess, but cold, hard knowledge. Time was running out like water. It was only a matter of hours before the ship sank. Ah, my dear listeners, those dark waters were conquering faster than anyone could have predicted. But the ship's crew and passengers had not yet fully grasped the scale of the tragedy. So what happened on the deck of the Titanic in those moments? What chaos ensued as people witnessed the fate of this gigantic ship? Let's listen to the echoes of this disaster together. My dear friends, I take you now to the most difficult moments of Titanic's fateful night. That night, after the collision, silence reigned for a while. But this was the calm before the storm. On the decks below, the cold arms of the water moved a little further with each passing minute, as the crew tried to understand how serious the ship's injuries were. At this point, few knew the truth. The ship was sinking, and all they had left was a race against time to save lives. On a ship like the Titanic, one should have been prepared for such a scenario, right? But unfortunately, the reality was far from that. As the evacuation process began, the shortcomings of both procedures and equipment became apparent. Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats on board. This was enough to rescue only half of the more than 2,200 passengers and crew on board. Moreover, during the evacuation, it would become clear that even these lifeboats were not being used to their full capacity. Imagine, some lifeboats were launched with only 12 or 15 people, even though they had a capacity for 70 people. The fear of the people and the lack of organization made the sinking of the ship even more tragic. In this chaos, the only rule the crew had was women and children first. However, even this rule was not always consistently applied. On the upper decks, where the first-class passengers were located, the officers were more disciplined and directed women and children to the lifeboats with priority. So much so that many first-class women, as well as their maids, managed to escape. However, when we reached the third class, things took a completely different turn. On the lower decks, crowding and panic prevailed. Some third-class passengers were trapped in different parts of the ship, lost in the chaos of the corridors, trying to reach the lifeboats. It is even said that some doors were locked, preventing third-class passengers from reaching the upper decks. These moments were not only a tragedy, but also a shameful test for humanity. Can you imagine the atmosphere on board? On the one hand, desperate fathers trying to save their families. On the other, crowds pushing each other to get into the lifeboats as soon as possible. Some passengers still held out hope that the ship would not sink. This hope showed how Titanic's reputation as the unsinkable ship could penetrate the human mind, even in the most fateful moments. However, as the water slowly rose, the truth was painfully coming to the surface. The fear and helplessness in the eyes of the men left behind as women and children were taken into the lifeboats was one of the most unforgettable scenes of the night. At this point, the impact of class distinction on the tragedy became even more apparent. While most of the first-class passengers had easier access to the lifeboats, those in the third class had to fight to survive. Oh, my friends, how many people waited on deck that night with one last hope? Some were praying, some were saying goodbye to their loved ones. But in all this chaos and pain, the sinking of the Titanic was not yet complete. And what did those who could not board the lifeboats do? What fate did they meet on this dark night? Oh, my friends, how many people waited on deck that night with one last hope? Some were praying, some were safely home. Ah, my dear friends, I take you now to the deepest, most unforgettable moments of that terrible night. As the hours ticked by, Titanic's fate became inevitable. As the icy waters continued to swallow the lower parts of the ship, there was both terror and despair in the eyes of the people on deck. Everyone now understood that this journey was over and that salvation was possible for very few. But one had to live through that night to see how strong and resilient the human spirit can be. Even in the midst of chaos, some showed great courage and solidarity. Remembering these moments in Titanic's story will always fill us with both sadness and admiration. As the cold water rose from the lower decks of the ship and moved upwards, fear and panic grew. On the deck, people were divided into two groups. One group, those who had managed to get into the lifeboats. The other group, those who had to stay behind and face their fate. In this second group, there were people in tears, children hugging their loved ones, and those who were thinking of jumping into the sea with one last hope. Most of them knew that the freezing cold of the ocean would kill them in a few minutes. But even this knowledge was not enough to diminish the horror of the moment. The screams of the people, combined with the roar of the sea, echoed like a lament that covered the earth. Ah, but there was another scene that made that night unforgettable, both heartbreaking and honorable: the ship's band. Yes, my friends, These brave musicians did not put down their instruments, even as the ship sank into the waters. The music they played to bring peace to people's hearts shone like light on a cold and dark night. As the story goes, the musicians bid farewell to the world by playing the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Wasn't this brave act indeed one of the purest examples of the human spirit's desire to do something for others, even in difficult times? The sound of the music disappeared with the ship into the depths of the ocean, but its echo remained in the memory forever. And then came Titanic's final moments. The ship, like a great giant, first leaned forward and then suddenly slid backwards. During this movement, its massive steel hull gave way and split in two. It was an indescribable shock for everyone present. Some people lost their last hope that the ship would not sink. Others thought that this new situation might offer a chance of salvation. But the reality was the same for everyone. Titanic was now being pulled into the depths of the ocean at a deadly speed. The aft part of the ship stayed afloat for a while longer, and then it too slowly sank. The silent closing of the waters contrasted with a star-studded night sky. In the midst of these terrible moments, a handful of people were trying to survive on the cold waters. But even though rescue teams were on their way, for most of them help would come too late. What about these people, abandoned to their fate in the icy waters? How did their story continue? And now I invite you to those moments of desperation, but engraved in human history. Ah, my dear friends, as Titanic's glorious voyage turns into a dark tragedy, the stories of those who survived allow us to explore the deepest reaches of the human will. After the ship sank, all that remained was the cold, dark Atlantic and the desperate struggles for survival that beat in the chest of this colossal tragedy. That night, the lifeboats on the sea were silent witnesses of fear and the will to survive. For some, the lifeboats symbolized salvation. For others, these small wooden boats were as silent as a tomb. Because at every moment, the deadly coldness of the water and helplessness put the human spirit to a severe test. The people in the lifeboats were surrounded by screams that spread in all directions. The cries of those who had fallen into the water tore the silence of the night and stabbed the hearts of everyone in the lifeboats like a knife. The passengers, crammed into the cramped space of the wooden boats, waited with trembling bodies for a glimmer of hope in the darkness of the water. The cold, nearing freezing on the surface of the sea, pierced through their flesh like a needle, consuming them a little more every second. In just a few minutes, the screams of those who had fallen into the water diminished, and they surrendered to the great silence. The eyes of those sitting in the lifeboats were tearing with the weight of witnessing these moments, and their hearts were petrified at the sight of a human landscape filled with such despair. Some lifeboats were carrying people far below their capacity. Those sitting in these boats were struggling with feelings of guilt and fear. They looked at each other, questioning why they were not taking more people, but they could not find an answer. Those in charge of the lifeboats did not want to take any risks. The violence of the waves and the possibility of the boats breaking condemned them to stay where they were. But in the other lifeboats, the situation was completely different. In the crammed boats, people huddled together, trying to survive by sharing the warmth of their bodies. But even this warmth was not enough to resist the frozen breath of the deadly Atlantic. That night, the moonlight and the flickering lights of the stars that fell over the water, however beautiful the scene for the survivors, could not calm the storm in their souls. A woman sitting in a lifeboat held her child tightly in her arms, but she knew that the little body was no longer moving. On the other side, people who had fallen into the water and were somehow clinging to the boats begged them not to let go of their hands, but with each passing second their strength was draining away. And then there was one question on everyone's lips: will we be rescued? For the survivors, the horror of the weight was as torturous as the cold water. As the hours passed, the darkness of the night deepened, and no sound was heard except the roar of the sea and the heavy breathing of the people. Everyone was waiting for a light, a ship, a hope. But until the arrival of the rescue teams, every moment in these small lifeboats revealed both the greatest strength and the deepest helplessness of human beings. So was the salvation that came at the end of this wait really a consolation for everyone? Or did survival mean carrying the weight of that tragedy for a lifetime? The answer to these questions would echo in the minds of those who survived that night for years to come. Ah, my dear friends, let us return to that cold and dark Atlantic night. All that remained of Titanic's Splendor was a sunken wreck, bodies floundering in the icy waters, and the terrified looks of the survivors. It was well past midnight when the ship sank, the ocean's silence broken only by the cries for help and the sobs of those waiting in the lifeboats. But in that darkness, a ray of hope appeared from far away. RMS Carpathia. Carpathia was a transatlantic ship belonging to Cunard Line at that time. When she received the first distress calls from Titanic, she was on course for New York. As soon as the captain of the ship, Arthur Rostron, received the SOE message, he turned the ship to Titanic's coordinates without hesitation. The engines were switched on at full capacity, the boilers fired at a higher rate than ever before. The crew was given orders to prepare. Blankets, hot drinks, food, and medical supplies were prepared. The heroic crew of the Carpathia mobilized everything to save thousands of people who needed help. Dear listeners, it took hours for the Carpathia to reach the rescue site. 3 hours had passed since the sinking of the Titanic, and the survivors were trying to survive in the deadly cold in the middle of the dark ocean. Those sitting in the lifeboats were huddling together to keep from freezing, trying to find morale as best they could. But for most of those drifting in the icy waters, hope was already lost. Hypothermia had silenced their struggling bodies. When the Carpathia finally reached Titanic's location, Captain Rostron and his crew were met with a heartbreaking sight. The lifeboats were littered with bodies. The waters had become the silent witness of both despair and tragedy. But there were still people in the lifeboats who held a glimmer of hope. As the crew painstakingly took the survivors on board, each face bore the scars of the horror. Women and children were freezing. Some were still in shock. Others were calling out the names of family members they had lost on the Titanic. Each passenger on board the Carpathia was the bearer of a different story. Some burst into tears as they recounted the moment the ship sank. Others buried their pain in silence. One survivor described the last moments of the musicians. Another, the struggle to survive in the lifeboats. The crew wrapped survivors in blankets and served soup to keep them warm, while Carpathia's doctors tended to those particularly affected by hypothermia. In the early hours of that morning, the last of Titanic's passengers were rescued. But this horrific event was the beginning of a tragedy that would shake the world to its core. The RMS Carpathia did not see Titanic sink, but she witnessed one of the most heroic rescues in history. Those rescued would go on to tell the story of the Titanic, and in the aftermath of this catastrophe, a great change would begin in the world. But dear listeners, the story of Titanic did not end there. With the first light of that morning, a question was echoing. Who would the survivors' accounts place the responsibility for this great tragedy on? How would the world react to this tragedy? Let's meet in the next episode to look for the answers to these questions. Ah, my friends, after the Titanic sank into the silent ocean waters, not only a ship, but also people's faith in safety, modern technology, and invincibility was deeply wounded. But the disaster was not just a tragedy. It set off a shockwave that reverberated around the world. By daybreak, the story of the Titanic was not only on the lips of the survivors, but spread rapidly through telegrams and newspaper headlines. That morning, the world woke up to the news of a great disaster. The first news reports were in a state of bewilderment, unable to grasp the full extent of the event. Given that the Titanic was the allegedly unsinkable ship, the news seemed like an illusion. From London to New York, from Paris to Tokyo, newspapers were filled with headlines such as "Titanic has sunk." Initially, however, little information was available about the extent of the losses and the number of survivors. This lack of information fueled speculation. For a while, there were even false reports that everyone on board had been rescued. It took a few days for the truth to emerge, and it was then that the world learned that the story of the Titanic contained many omissions and errors, not only at the time of the sinking, but also before. The stories in the media both dramatized the tragedy and highlighted the human stories. On the one hand, there were stories of heroism. Musicians reportedly kept playing until the last moment. Some of the first-class passengers helped evacuate women and children. On the other hand, the dark side of the tragedy was revealed. Only a few people were allowed to board the lifeboats, leaving the capacity to save more empty. Titanic was a brutal demonstration that class divisions existed at sea. As the extent of the disaster became clear, the search for those responsible accelerated. Investigations were launched, both in the United States and Britain. In the U.S., a commission chaired by Senator William Alden Smith called survivors to testify. Since the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, died in the tragedy, most testimony was given by crew and passengers. During the hearings, details such as iceberg warnings sent to Titanic's captain but ignored, the ship's insufficient number of lifeboats, and the ship's high speed, despite the seriousness of the danger, came to light. In the UK inquiries, the executives of the White Star Line, especially J. Bruce Ismay, were heavily criticized. Ismay had become the focus of both media and public anger for surviving by getting into one of the lifeboats. These inquiries led not only to an understanding of Titanic, but also to important changes in the maritime world. But my friends, you will have to wait a little longer to find out how these changes took shape and what are the deep scars left by Titanic. So, how would the world redefine maritime safety after this tragedy? And what lessons would it learn from Titanic's mistakes? In the next episode, we will look for answers to these questions together. Ah, my friends, the tragedy of the Titanic brought not only the story of those who lost their lives that night, but also a turning point that changed world maritime history forever. In the aftermath of this horrific event, humanity not only grieved, but also made profound changes to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. I will tell you the story of those changes. The destruction of the Titanic in the icy waters revealed many neglected shortcomings in the maritime industry. So much so that a ship touted as unsinkable was actually surprisingly inadequate in terms of safety measures. Lifeboats were inadequate. Iceberg warnings were ignored. Even the crew was not properly trained on how to act in a crisis. The story of the Titanic brought to light the weaknesses of the maritime industry and made it imperative that these weaknesses be addressed. In 1914, after the Titanic disaster, the foundations of a new era in maritime safety were laid. Prepared by the International Maritime Organization, IMO, and known as the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, this regulation was a turning point in world maritime history. This convention required every ship sailing on the seas to meet certain safety standards. Every detail from the number of lifeboats to the training of the ship's crew was reconsidered. Having enough lifeboats on board was no longer a choice, but an obligation. These lifeboats were to be more evenly distributed, not only in terms of number, but also in terms of accessibility to passengers of all classes. Furthermore, the lack of communication during the disaster was a major lesson. Titanic's captain ignored incoming telegrams. The danger was realized too late. Within the scope of SOLAS, it was made compulsory to have a radio operator working 24 hours a day on every ship. Radio communication standards for use in emergencies were set, and the maritime world established a signal was sent. All nearby ships responded immediately. This system, my friends, was the basis for the international SOS call that is still used today. The loss of the Titanic also revolutionized ship design. The ship's watertight compartments were an innovation at the time, but they were not designed to fully protect the ship. After the disaster, naval engineering standards were redefined. On new ships, watertight bulkheads were designed to protect the entire ship, not just to a certain height. There were also stricter regulations on hull materials and structural strength. Each new ship began to be built with an approach that prioritized not only luxury but also survival. The impact of the pandemic on society is evident from the return of events. My friends, the sinking of the Titanic was not just the loss of a ship. It was a reminder of how fragile humanity is. The measures taken in the aftermath of this disaster have made every new step in maritime history safer. But do you want to know how these changes were actually implemented, and how a new maritime era began in the shadow of Titanic? In the next episode, we will explore the lasting impact of these changes on the maritime world and Titanic's legacy. Ah, my dear friends, sometimes history comes back whispering its secrets buried in dark waters. The story of the Titanic may seem to have ended on that icy night in 1912 when it sank into the waters. But in fact, thanks to the perseverance of those who tracked down this great ship, it began anew in a completely different dimension. Today I will tell you the story of the Titanic's breathtaking journey from its disappearance to its recovery. By 1985, Titanic was no longer just a tragedy, but a target that pushed the boundaries of science and technology. At that time, marine biologist and ocean explorer Robert Ballard decided to track down the ship hidden in the dark depths of the sea. But this journey required much more than an ordinary dive. The wreckage of the Titanic lay in endless darkness, about 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. The pressure at that depth could crush even the most durable equipment. But Ballard was determined to combine humanity's technological power and desire for exploration to make one of the greatest maritime discoveries in history. Ballard and his team developed a deep-sea research robot they named Argo. It was equipped with cameras and lights that could scan the bottom of the sea. After days of searching, on September 1, 1985, Argo captured the first traces of Titanic. At first, only a pile of coal and a few pieces of metal were noticed, but then a huge cauldron appeared, and this was conclusive proof that the wreck of the Titanic had been reached. Dear friends, if you could have seen the excitement in Ballard's eyes as he described this moment, he had found not only a ship, but also a dream that had been lost throughout history. Being a warrior, my heart told me to follow him, which is what I did. On the journey, a ship called Suntrap. The wreck of the Titanic lay at the bottom of the sea like a gigantic graveyard. It turned out that the ship had split in two. The bow was about 600 meters away. This was an indication of the incredible strength of the ship in its final moments. Around the ship, the passengers' belongings were still in place. Porcelain plates, perfume bottles, even the passengers' shoes were found. Each one a silent witness to the tragedy of that night. But this discovery was important not only for historians and scientists, but also for the millions of people who were captivated by Titanic's story. The wreck of the Titanic was a monument to humanity's great mistakes and great dreams at the same time. Ballard believed that this wreck should be preserved not as a museum, but as a sacred site, because this was a place where the lives of more than 1,500 people ended, not just a ship. The findings from the wreckage of the Titanic provided important information not only about the structure of the ship, but also about the way of life in 1912. Every detail, from the materials used on board to the passengers' belongings, reflected the social classes and technological development of that period. However, the wreck of Titanic taught us not only about the past, but also about the future. It reminded us once again how safety standards at sea have changed, and of humanity's determination not to repeat such tragic mistakes. But my friends, what other secrets did the wreck of the Titanic whisper to us? How has the story of this giant of the deep become a legacy in human history? In the next episode, we will talk about Titanic's cultural and historical legacy. Aren't you curious about how this great ship has been engraved in books, movies, and the collective memory of humanity? Oh, my dear friends, let me take you for a moment back to that cold Atlantic night. As the Titanic was heading towards its tragic end, much more than the ship's massive metal hull was sinking. The lives, hopes, and stories of thousands of people were also sinking into the dark depths. But strangely enough, there are some stories that even the darkness of time cannot erase. Here are the unforgettable memories of the passengers and crew of the Titanic. These stories, some heroic, some tragic, remind us how strong and yet how fragile humanity is. Imagine that some of those on board were there for a luxury trip. Among the first-class passengers were millionaires, businessmen, artists. John Jacob Astor IV was one of the richest men in America. He was on his honeymoon with his young wife. But this tragic story made us remember him as a man who stripped himself of his immense power and tried to protect the woman he loved. Astor put his wife on one of the lifeboats, then calmly stepped back. His words still echo, "I can get on a lifeboat later." But, oh my dear friends, that later never came. And then remember Benjamin Guggenheim. This wealthy businessman, a first-class passenger, performed a heroic act during the sinking of the ship that made him forget his identity. He helped the lifeboats, comforted those who were scared, and is known to have said these words before facing death: "We have put on our best clothes, and now we will die like gentlemen. Indeed, he and his valet were seen in their last moments in elegant suits. A Titanic was not just a tragedy of the rich. The stories of the third-class passengers were perhaps quieter, but just as heartbreaking. They were people dreaming of starting a new life. Some couples set off on this great journey with their children, some young people alone. For example, Margaret Rice, a young Irish woman, and her 5 children were looking for a new beginning in America. But the Titanic buried their hopes in the icy waters. Margaret's struggle to reach the lifeboats with her children still lives in the memory. For Margaret, the world-plain French began to lose its charm. And of course, we must not forget the stories of the crew. Who can forget the band of the Titanic? As the ship sank, they continued to play to calm the fear and bring a modicum of peace. Conductor Wallace Hartley and his team clung to their instruments until their last moments. It is said that the last piece they played was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Their sacrifice continues to be remembered as one of the most touching moments in history. Another story is that of the ship's captain, Edward Smith. At the height of his career, this experienced sailor became a legend when the Titanic sank. It is said that the captain did not leave the bridge in the ship's final moments, but went down with the ship. His loyalty is a reminder of the heavy burden of leadership and responsibility. And that night there were hundreds of unsung heroes. People who guided women and children into lifeboats, helped strangers, even jumped into the freezing waters to save others. Each and every one of them, in that moment, showed what it means to be human. The story of the Titanic is a testament not just to a disaster, but to the fact that the human spirit can shine, even in dark times. But now I ask you, dear friends, what is the lesson of these stories? What hope has humanity carried from the dark night of the Titanic to today? In the next chapter, we will discuss how this tragic story has become a cultural legacy and legend. How do you think Titanic's voice echoed in the depths of history? Ah, my dear friends, here the sad melody of the Titanic finally reaches its final notes. But this is a beginning rather than an end, because the story of Titanic is not just about the sinking of a ship or the mourning of lost lives. It is a mirror in which humanity confronts its mistakes and learns from them. So what exactly does Titanic tell us? Is what she left behind a tragedy, a warning, or an epic about the resilience of the human spirit? Let us seek answers to these questions together. In 1912, that gigantic ship left a mark not only on the depths of the ocean, but also on human history. The wreckage of the Titanic still lies at the bottom of the Atlantic like a grave. But this grave is a monument not only to loss, but also to the enormous consequences of human error. This so-called unsinkable ship reminds us of how arrogance and carelessness are powerless in the face of the forces of nature. The story of the Titanic whispers how progress and technology can become a dangerous force when embraced with unchecked admiration. But, dear friends, the story of the Titanic is not only a warning, it is also a manifestation of the beauty of the human spirit. The memories of survivors tell of a night filled not only with fear and tragedy, but also with courage, sacrifice, and love. Mothers putting their children on lifeboats, fathers giving their places to strangers, musicians comforting those who feared the cold death with the soothing notes of music. Titanic proved that humanity can shine even on a dark night. Today, Titanic is not just the name of a ship, it is a symbol. Titanic represents the hopes and dreams of mankind, but also its fragility. It has been reincarnated in our culture in many ways, from movies to books, songs to artworks. In each retelling, the story of Titanic grows a little bigger, a little deeper, but each retelling carries the same basic message. Humanity must learn from its mistakes, and these lessons, my dear friends, are not only maritime. The tragedy of the Titanic reminds us what it means to be human, how precious life is, and what can be done for it. The ship was a marvel of engineering, yes, but that night the wonder of the human spirit shone even brighter. The changes that followed the Titanic are a great step forward for humanity. But even these changes cannot bring back what was lost that night. That's why Titanic will always be a warning, but also as a symbol of hope and courage. What about you? What do you make of the story that Titanic left behind? How do its lessons resonate in our lives today? And can humanity really take the necessary steps to prevent future Titanics? Let us ponder these questions together. My dear friends, the story of the Titanic was not just a story to be preserved in history books or in the depths of the sea. No, it was more than that. It became a legend, rooted in the minds, hearts, and culture of humanity. Over the years, Titanic has come to mean much more than a ship. It came to life again in the pages of books, in the shining lights of the silver screen, and in the serene narratives of documentaries. So much so that even at the mere mention of Titanic's name, an image pops into everyone's mind. The magnificent ship, the passengers dreaming of a glorious voyage and the tragedy that followed. So what is the secret of this immortalization? Why did Titanic leave such a deep mark? First of all, books play an important role in the immortalization of Titanic. In the aftermath of the disaster, shelves overflowing with survivors' memoirs, journalists' investigations, and historians' meticulous studies have turned Titanic into a legend. Each one tells the story from a different angle, with a different voice. The luxurious but short-lived adventures of the surviving first-class passengers, the drama of the hopeful immigrants in third class, and the courageous stories of the ship's crew. These books portray Titanic not only as a tragedy, but also as a story that plumbs the depths of the human spirit. Of course, my dear friends, Titanic's name has most resonated in the world of cinema. The most famous, of course, was the epic movie that hit the big screen in 1997. Directed by James Cameron and bringing millions to tears, this movie portrayed Titanic not only as a tragedy, but also as a love story. This movie made the audience feel the splendor of the ship and the deep pain of loss at the same time. But let's not forget that this was not the only movie about Titanic. Her story has been recreated in many different ways, starting from the silent movie era. Each movie added its own perspective to the ship's story and kept Titanic alive in the memory of different generations. Documentaries have also played a major role in preserving Titanic's legacy. Diving to view the majestic wreck beneath the sea, combined with modern technology to produce breathtaking images. After Robert Ballard's discovery of the wreck, these documentaries shed light on the true story of Titanic. Imagining the old saloons, the rusted railings, and the hopes that the sunken ship once held, left a deep impression on the hearts of viewers. These images showed how far humanity can go, but also how it can face the consequences of its mistakes. But Titanic is unforgettable, not only for its artifacts but also for its symbolic meaning. On the one hand, the ship represents the price of humanity's arrogance and overconfidence. But on the other hand, it symbolizes the resilience and hope of the human spirit. Titanic is a test of our faith in progress and technology. The sinking of a ship that people said was unsinkable calls us to humility and respect for the power of nature. At the same time, the courage, sacrifice, and solidarity shown in a crisis reflects the essence of what it means to be human. And now, my friends, here we come to the end of our story. But you know what? The story of the Titanic is never really over. It will always live on as a reminder, as a lesson, and also as an inspiration. So, what have you learned from this story? What does Titanic's silent melody beneath the waves tell you? Will humanity be able to carry her legacy into the future? Or will we witness the birth of new Titanics? If you are interested in more information about the Titanic, I will list the birth of Isle H. Counton. These are the questions each of us must seek answers to.